How we doing, guys? Good? Surviving. Okay, well, that's good. Sometimes surviving is about all you can hope for, so that's all right. No worries. Class is winding down. As you know, this is lecture 9. We only get 11. So yeah, we're like almost done. And the reason I like to point that out, and sometimes I even pointed out a little bit earlier, is I don't know if you're noticing, but classes here go really fast. Have you guys noticed that? Yes. That's the way classes are going to go. From this class here that you're in now is sort of a microcosm of the rest of your time here at Full Sail. You're going to have a lot of material in a short period of time. You really got to focus and bring your A game every day, and realize that before you know it, the class is over. A month seems like a long time until you go through it, right? And it's really weird for me because I work here. So I'm in this sort of this time-space loop of some kind. It's like Groundhog Day. It just, every month goes by super, super fast, and before I know it, it's all done. And you guys are on to the next class. So just, again, take a look at how this month went for you or is going for you. And you just got to ask yourself some really important questions. You know, am I happy with how I'm doing? Did I really apply myself? Am I putting aside 2 hours every night in addition to lab time to work on this material? Am I asking questions in lab? Am I seeking help online? This is the new way you have to approach your education. As I've said previously, you've not had classes like this before in your lives. There's no way you've had a class like this before in your life. Not the way we present it, not the material we present. It's a whole new animal, and you have to learn how to adapt to this new way, this education that we've set up for you guys. Does that make sense? You can't rely on the stuff that worked for you previously. That stuff, I mean, it was good for you to learn some rudimentary skills in terms of teaching yourself how to do things, but that's by no means the template that you move forward for the rest of your life with. Does that make sense? Okay, so just, again, just take a look at how things are going, Gesundheit, and kind of make some evaluations. How am I doing? What could I do differently? What could I do better? And these are things that you have to ask yourself and make adjustments to, because that's how we learn, we live, and we grow. And for me, I don't, you know, again, everybody's different, but for me, I have a real hard time with what if. What if really bothers me. So I don't let what if come into play. Does that make sense? I remove what if from the variables. And I really try to do everything I can. And if things don't pan out, okay, hey, I threw myself at this thing with everything I've got and it didn't pan out. I can live with that. But if I didn't give it everything I got and it didn't pan out, there's nothing I can do about that. That's me. Does that make sense? So just something to think about. And again, all of that might not have made any sense to you whatsoever right now. Maybe later it makes sense to you. But just things to think about. Always evaluate, always make an adjustment, and realize that through struggle is where you're going to learn the most. And oftentimes, through failure, that's your greatest teacher, because you will learn so much from what you get wrong versus from what you get right. And I think that's just a function of human beings, because I think what we do right, we take for granted. That which we get wrong, we punish ourselves over, and we sweat over it, and we fight our way through it so that doesn't happen again, because we don't like that. Does that make sense? So you will learn much more from the stuff you get wrong, from the stuff you get right. But the key is study what you got wrong, figure out what happened, and come up with a plan to make sure that doesn't happen again. Does that make sense? Okay, just suggestions, me to you, strategies that have helped me. So hopefully they can help you too. But anyway, so today we've got more material to talk about. We're going to talk more about UVs. We're going to get into some more complex UV tools. And we're going to actually get into the process where, hopefully we'll have enough time, we'll get into the process where we'll create an AO pass, or ambient occlusion pass, for our geometry. And what that will help us out a lot with is realizing the importance of good UV layout. Because if your UV layout is poor, your textures will look terrible. So being able to see that firsthand, how good UV layout lends itself towards good quality textures in that process and how they come together, that's going to be a big help for us in terms of why are we doing this. Because UVs, are tedious, they're slow, they're not much fun. So why do we do them? And again, textures is the big win. So we're going to get into some of those things today, and hopefully they will be fun. All right, let's take a look at some improvement of the UV layout. And what we're talking about here is when we go through the UV process, we apply a texture to the geometry with a checker pattern on it. That lets us see how good or how well the UVs are laid out. And then once we've seen those, we map it to reorganize it so that everything looks pretty good. And we talked about the idea of bringing everything back into the 0 to 1. Well, in some instances, your UV layout, even though you've mapped the pieces, still not looking so great. So we need to improve on that. We need to make things better. So what can we do to improve that UV layout? And what we're going to talk about today is the processes where we will cut UV shells to separate them from one another, sew UV shells together, move the pieces around, use some tools that are basically like ironing to help flatten out the UVs and get a better quality layout. So all of these things go towards making a better UV layout in the end so that we have nice UVs so that we can make a texture for whatever it is we happen to be mapping. And something I wanted to point out for you guys, here's an object here. Let's say we're UV mapping this marker, right? And in terms of the marker, there's a couple of different pieces here for the marker. It's modeled the way it should be based on the materials that the object is made of. But what you will notice is that when I'm looking at this piece right here, this is one piece, but you can see that it is actually composed of at least 3 UV shells. And the way I know that there's 3 UV shells here is if you take a look right here, do these squares seamlessly meld into these squares on this piece here? No, they don't. What you see there is what we call a texture seam. And that's where 2 UV shells do not touch each other. Does that make sense? There's a separation there. And I can see it because these squares do not seamlessly transition from one to the other. Now, in terms of seams and seamless transition, when we make clothing for human beings, we are taking cloth, which is a 2D idea, and we're cutting it to fit you, a 3D idea. Does that make sense? UV mapping is very much like tailoring because literally I'm trying to create a 2D version of something that will fit very tightly over the real object, which is 3D. Does that make sense? That's why you will hear a lot of terminology when we're talking about UV mapping that uses words from what you would imagine a tailor would use. Because literally that's what we're doing. We're cutting cloth, we're trying to stitch it together in some places, cut some spacing into it so that it can open up in other areas so that it fits as nicely as possible around the 3D object, whatever that happens to be. Does that make sense? A bit of tailor stuff going on there. All right, so again, I can see that there's a seam here. I can also see that there's a seam here. 2 different reasons though. One, these squares do not seamlessly transition from one to the other, so I know that there's an edge there, a UV shell. But these squares are much bigger than those squares. Does that make sense? So I know that these are different in terms of their resolution. And we're going to be talking more about that today. Resolution is about the quality of the image we're looking at. Now, and you can see these are rectangles. These are kind of rectangular. So there's a bunch of things in here that could be better. Does that make sense? So what we're going to talk about today is how do we improve on that? How do we make that look better? And we have a number of great tools at our disposal to do that. Now, as I said, when it comes to UV shells and their manipulation, we're going to be using the Cut UVs tool and the Move and Sew UVs tool. And again, it's very much like tailoring. We're trying to cut these shells, move them around, and sew them together in such a way that we improve the quality of our UV layout. Now, you know we're going to have a fun little activity to do it because it's easier to learn it when I'm talking about it, and we do it together. So here's a little activity for us to work on. So we got to make sure we've set our project to the activity file folder. Set. And then we're going to go to File, Open Scene, and we want our advanced UV activity. Boop. All right. So here's our marker, and you can see, again, the squares here are larger than there, and we can definitely see the seams. So where we can double check this is by looking into our UV editor. Who can tell me where that is? Where's the UV editor? It's under UV. So if I go to UV editor, and open that up, all right, but I don't see any UVs. What's the problem? I don't see anything in here. You have to select it. If I select the geometry, now all of a sudden I can see the UVs. Oh, okay, so there are my UV shells. And these shells represent this object laid out flat. Now, in terms of my UV shells, again, all windows in Maya show the same thing, just from different perspectives, literally and figuratively. If I come in here and I select the edge where I know there's a seam, right here, because I can see that those things, this square is much bigger, they don't smoothly transition. Where the heck is that? So when I go into my UV editor, I see, oh, okay, these two edges here connect to these two edges here. And the thing that is very important for you to understand is, because these shells are in separate pieces, that doesn't mean my geometry is in separate pieces. The geometry is in one piece, but we can represent it with a series of shells if we wish. Again, much like the idea that I can draw a map of the United States, and if I tear it in half, I'm not physically tearing the United States. I'm just tearing the paper that represents it. So point being here, I've got these two shells, and again, in terms of, if I'm going to grab this one here and just move it to the side, and I'm going to grab this one here, and I'm going to move it to the side. All right, and you can see that these two shells are right next to each other. See, watch, if I move them, you'll see they move together. Okay, so those two shells are definitely right next to each other, but again, they're not connecting right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Move and Sew tool to sew them together. Now, looking at this marker, since this edge right here, and I'll select it for you, I'll just double click on it so you can see. I've selected this edge on my geometry, all right? And that means that this edge and this edge are basically the same edge, right? I can select it out here, I can select it in here, doesn't make any difference, but I know that that's the same edge. But if those are the same edge, how do I sew them together? That doesn't look right. This piece is much smaller than that piece. They don't look like they fit together. Does that make sense? Right? I can't sew this to that and it fits perfectly. Does that make sense? They need to be the same size, because they should be the same size, because in the object, the physical object, they're the same size. So again, when I look at this, I see bigger squares and smaller squares. Okay, that's wrong. But the problem is the proportions of these two parts of the same object are not accurate. That's what the square sizes are telling me. I can look at the shells and confirm it. Yeah, there's no way I can sew those together and they're the same size. Does that make sense? The squares are the hint that there's something wrong there, but I can see it there. Now, in terms of what to do, well, to fix that, we can actually sew these things together. And the difference is, with cloth, when it comes to sewing things together, there's a seam that's left behind, right? If you look at my shirt, the pattern here doesn't fluidly transition from the front to the back. There's definitely a seam and I can see it. But the key is, the seam is somewhere that's hard to see, right? My arms are usually by my side. So when we're creating UV shells, there are going to be seams. If you take something 3D and try to turn it into 2D, just like when we took the earth and made that flat, right? Sorry, Chris. When we had to make the earth flat, we had to put little cuts in the ocean in order to unfold it all the way. Just like if we took a cardboard box, we'd have to cut the corners to get it to fold flat. There are going to be cuts somewhere. But the key is, you want those cuts to be in places where you want them to be, where they are less conspicuous. Does that make sense? So it's not by any mistake or coincidence that the seam for my shirt is under my arm so you can't see it. So when we have to have seams, we make sure we hide them. However, we have the ability to sew seams together to where you can't see them. And that's the cool thing about UVs. If I sew cloth together, I can see where they sew together. With UVs, where they sew together, it's seamless. It's like it magically disappears, right? So let's take a look at that process. If I want to sew a UV shell together to any UV shell, if I select an edge on one, I can see the brother and sister edges. These two are supposed to go together. This one attaches to that one. So I can literally grab them both from one end to the other, and you'll notice I haven't selected all the way around, just the edges where I want to sew them together. All right? And then I'm going to go to cut and sew, and you'll see within the UV editor, cut and sew, and you choose move and sew. Now some of you might have the older version of Maya's UV editor, in which case you're going to go all the way to the left under polygons and go down and you'll see move and sew. It's about the last quarter of the drop down. And don't ask me why Autodesk decided to put two different versions of the UV editor in the same copy of Maya. No idea. But it's under polygons all the way on the left. Go down to the last quarter, you'll see move and sew. All right, so under cut and sew, I choose move and sew, and it literally sews the two pieces together. Now, if you look at our end result here, you can see, you can see, oh, okay, it does smoothly transition from here to there now. The squares do flow together. I don't see a seam like I saw before, but it's distorted. Let's take a look at it. Before, after, before, after. Make sense? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do instead. Rather than just sew them together, because I can select any two edges and tell Maya move and sew, and it'll sew them together no matter where they are in the UV editor. This time, I'm going to size my shell so it looks like they fit together first. Then I'm going to sew them together. So I grab my UVs, and I'm just going to use my scale tool. And I'm going to make it bigger. And what I'm trying to do is make it look like these two pieces could go together. And if this edge and this edge are the same edge, they should be the same size. Does that make sense? They're supposed to be the same edge. I'm just going to size it a little bit there. And again, select all the edges on the one side, and it selects them both. Now keep an eye on this area here. I'm going to do my move and sew again. Now, that looks way better. I got a nice smooth transition from this surface to this surface. It's the same object. There doesn't need to be a seam there. Now it's sewn together and it looks pretty good. All right, nice fluid transition. How about the squares? Are they more similarly sized now? Right. It wasn't the move and sew tool that made them the same size. It was me making the shell bigger. Now they are the same resolution. Therefore, the squares are the same size. Does that make sense? Okay. That's why we're sewing these shells together. We're trying to make them the same size so their resolution is identical. Let's talk a little bit about resolution for a second, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with that. This is an image of an oil barrel. Digital images are composed of pixels. They are the smallest unit, right? It's a little square dot. And we put all these pixels together and they make pictures. We can make them different colors or whatever, but everything is a pixel eventually. That is the smallest thing. Now, this is a low resolution image. And what that means is there's not many pixels in that image. It looks okay now at this distance, but watch what happens as I get closer. All right? I keep clicking, I keep getting closer, and you start to see the pixels, right? Some people refer to these as the jaggies when you're looking at an image, right? It's all jaggy. I can see individual pixels because this is a low resolution image. It didn't take very long for me to get to pixel level. Does that make sense? Low resolution, poor quality image. I can't blow it up or it'll look terrible. Does that make sense? Because we've all had that problem. Flip side. Let's take a look at this oil barrel. This is a high resolution image. I can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. I still haven't got to the pixels yet because there are so many in here. This is a very dense picture. This is a high resolution image. I could blow this up with no problem. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Eventually, you get to the pixels. There they are. Does that make sense? So, pixels relates to resolution. Shell size relates to resolution, right? How does that work? Think of a jar of jelly beans, right? Jelly beans are pretty much a fairly uniform size. You can only get so many jelly beans in a jar, right? If you've got a small jar, you will have fewer jelly beans in it. If you have a big jar, you have a lot of jelly beans in it. Does that make sense? So the size of the shell will allow more jelly beans inside of it. Bigger shell, more jelly beans. Higher resolution, better quality image. Does that make sense? Okay, so size of the shell relates to resolution. So that stands to reason that on the same object, I can't have two different resolutions. Does that make sense? I can't have a low resolution shell right next to a high resolution shell because I'm going to see the jaggies on one of them. Does that make sense? The resolution has to agree. And that's what those squares are telling me. When the resolution is the same, the squares are the same size. Does that make sense? Because as I make my shells bigger, the squares get smaller. And as I make my shells smaller, the squares get bigger. Smaller jar, fewer jelly beans. Does that make sense? Is everybody with me on the jelly bean thing? I know it's early and we're all tired, but I'm hoping jelly beans is working. Okay. Let me tell you, I love jelly beans, but if we start eating those, we will be like, wow, like racquetballs for a couple minutes, and then boom. Go ahead. Not necessarily. Poorly modeled geometry might deform badly and then expose where seams are. Does that make sense? Much like if I made a shirt for myself and I didn't use a good pattern and I didn't cut it to fit myself well, I might cause it to rip in places if I did something, you know, energetic or exciting. Does that make sense at all? It will expose weaknesses in the seams. Not that it would come apart physically, but you would see the texture separate. Good geometry makes all the difference in the world, you know, because if something changes a lot of shape, that's where you're going to start to see texture seams because you'll see stretching and distortion, which is why I'm always really impressed with movies like Cars, where the models of the cars have amazing textures on them and their facial expressions are very broad. The geometry changes shape a lot. But if you look, those textures don't come apart. Those textures are strong. They hold well. Versus other movies where you'll see something start talking and then you'll start to see distortion taking place. The texture starts to warp and distort.
So we have the version of file that doesn't have the cutting, so
Yes, it has it, but it's under polygons. It's not under cut and sew. Polygons, way left, click the drop down, down near the bottom quarter or so. Again, Maya has 2 different versions of the UV editor in 2017. I can't tell you why. Go ahead.
The quick menu still there, so that the people with the lower models might be able to just use the quick menu.
Oh, you can use the buttons anytime. Yeah, the buttons are largely coded, so
Shift.
that's going to be in there.
Click on the edge, hit shift, and then so should be the top one. I don't know if it's going to work for anybody else.
Well, all you can do is test it. So, you know, it's a trial and error thing. But are we good on resolution? Does that make sense to everybody, what we're talking about? Okay. Because that's definitely important.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for playing. All right. So I've got those first 2 together. Let's take a look at this seam over here. We're going to do it again. Why not? All the cool kids do it. So if I select this edge here, I can see, because again, there's a seam there. There shouldn't be a seam because I'm trying to make it look smooth. This is one piece of geometry. And if I look in my UV editor, I can see, oh yeah, this edge here will be attaching to this edge here. Those are the brother and sister edges. So again, I can take this piece and literally just move it to where it's going to go. Now, in terms of its attachment, if this edge and this edge are effectively the same edge, right? Because they're going to sew together. You can see they're not the same size right now. Again, if I look at the thing as a whole, if this is supposed to attach to this, this is smaller. That can't be right. So their resolutions probably don't agree. And again, if I look at the object, I can see, yeah, these squares are a different size than those squares because the proportions of these shells are not right. So again, I'm just going to make it bigger. Grab these UVs, use my scale tool, whoops, use my scale tool, make it a little bit bigger. And again, I can either look at the squares here, or I can just look at my shells and see, oh, that's looking better right there. I'm a fan of that. So now I'm going to click this one, come over here, double click that one, and again, I'm going to move and sew and put those together. Now, in terms of these squares, again, they're not looking ideal. I'm looking very rectangle-y here. But you notice if I squash that top part down there, that looks better. More like squares. Things are starting to shape out a little bit better. As my UV shells look closer to the shape they should be, my square shape will improve. Does that make sense? My squares are my guide. I want you to know what they're telling you, though. That's why I'm showing you the other stuff, too. I don't want you to just take my word for it. Happy squares means good. Why do happy squares mean good? What's happening? That's what I want you to get. All right? So I can sew these things together. So here's where we start getting into some interesting ideas of moving and sewing. Now, let's say, for example, let me get this edge over here. This edge right here, again, this edge attaches to this edge because the object in question is a cylinder, so it's going to wrap around and attach. So we're looking at the marker cap is a cylinder. If I'm going to lay that out flat, I have to put a cut in it to lay it out flat. Does that make sense? What I'm looking at right here and right here are the 2 edges that should be attached to each other, but can't be because I'm trying to show it flat. Does that make sense? Should be attached. If I'm showing it flat, I can't do that. So that's a seam I can't avoid. I can't sew those together. I could try. Oh, look at that, it just collapsed on me. There we go. Before, after. You can see that's probably not good, right? Okay. So I can't sew those together. Some seams you will try to sew together, and it actually makes your UV layout worse. Does that make sense? So be aware, the goal is not no seams. The goal is nice UV layout. Keep your eye on the prize. Does that make sense? Always best possible UV layout. Not necessarily no seams. No one will ever say, wow, your texture looks like crap. But are there no seams? Does that make sense? So keep your eye on the prize. Nice UV layout is the goal. As few seams as possible as a secondary objective, yes. Great UV layout though, number one. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. So this is starting to come along, but here's where we start getting into, okay, what do I need this to do? If this is a still image of a marker, let's say I'm doing an advertising campaign for Markero, the greatest marker ever, right? And this is going to be a still image, and I'm never going to see this marker from any other angle. This is fine for where my seams are, because I can't see it. The seam's on the other side. Does that make sense? It's on the other side of the marker cap. It's over here, right? That's where my seam is, and you can see the distortion because they don't line up right. Does that make sense? Okay, here. Actually, let me do this. I'm just going to offset it a little bit so it's easier to see. That's where the seam is, right? Okay. Now, as long as I never see this marker from the other side, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to see it. It's a still image. But if I'm doing a commercial for Markero, the greatest marker ever, and let's say the camera moves around the marker and it shows it from all sides, right? As classical music plays. And F. Murray Abraham is in the background using that marker to draw something amazing. And I just saw the Bud Light commercial the other day and reminded me of him. You guys see Amadeus Salieri? Okay, awesome movie. Anyway, point being, I'm doing this commercial for Markero now, and my camera moves around and I actually see the other side of the marker. I can't have a texture seam there. That's not going to work. And I know the camera's going to see the other side of the marker because I look at the storyboards. Before we even start shooting this thing, I know exactly what the shots are going to be because I've been given a copy of the storyboards. So I know the camera's going to move around the marker. I can't have a seam on that side because the camera settles there eventually. Does that make sense? So if I can't have the seam on the other side and I can't have the seam on the front because the camera sees both, where do I put the seam? On the bottom where it can't be seen. Does that make sense? So here's where I have to create a seam where I want it to be because it's not where I want it right now. And here's where I'm going to use the cut UVs tool. This is going to do much the same thing. I'm going to cut the UVs where I want them to be cut. So I come over here and I say, you know what? I'd really like that seam to be right here on the bottom. Right? You guys see that? I want the seam on the bottom. Okay? That correlates to these edges here. So here's where I'm going to go to my UVs and cut UVs. All right? If you've got the older UV editor, it's again under polygons, cut UV edges. Very close to sew UV edges, is right around the same area. So I'm going to cut them. Now, These UVs have been cut, but I wouldn't know that until I try to move them. So what I'm going to do is select a UV or a couple of UVs where the separate, oh no, actually it does light it up now. It didn't used to always do that. I must have the show the UV borders on. But grab some UVs. But I don't know, I might not know where the edge of that is, and I need to separate it. Last class I told you guys there was a way to select just one UV and use that to grab the rest of a shell. Do you guys remember the button combination I need for that? There was a specific button combination. Anybody remember? My digital friends? Anybody? Bueller? Gesundheit? I can grab one UV or two UVs, Command key, and the right mouse button, 2 UV shell, and that will allow me to grab just that shell. And then look, let me go back over here. Do you see I've created a new seam and it's on the bottom now? And then I can literally take this shell and move it over here. Right? And you can see here's where the seam is, but I don't want it. You see that? So what I'm going to do is now grab this one, and I'm going to move and sew. So now this is a smooth transition. This is a smooth transition. But now my seam is on the bottom where I can't see it. Does that make sense? I put the seams where I want them, where they help me do my job. Does that make sense? Because it is just as much about smart seam placement when you're making good UV layout. Where do I put my seams? Under the arm. At the edge of something where two surfaces meet is a great place to put seams. If I'm UV mapping a character that's got pants, pants have a seam. Work with that. That should be your UV seam as well. Does that make sense? Okay, so we try to hide those seams whenever and wherever we can because they're going to be there. It's just put them in a good place. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. So we've got move and sew under our belt. All right, did anybody have trouble with moving and sewing? Did you guys, again, that's pretty straightforward, but I want to make sure. Okay, were you selecting the edges all the way around? Yeah, you just select the edge where you want the seam to be and you use cut UV edges. Different tool. Some of them sew them together, some of them cut them apart. It's specifically what are you doing? Again, think like a tailor. Okay, well we can come back and help you out specifically with whatever issue you're having, but we can definitely do that.
So if I try to select the edge on the actual shell itself, select the whole shell, and then
right, and you don't want to get the whole shell, you just want the part that you want to sew together. Again, if I'm trying to sew this panel of my shirt to this panel of my shirt, I only want to sew it here. I don't want to sew this to this and that, you know what I mean? Just these edges. So click one edge, go to the other side and double click that edge, and it will select everything in between. If you just double click, it's going to go all the way around. On the model or on your UVs? Everything. All right, I might have to look at that one specifically. I like your shirt, by the way. Go ahead. Okay. Can you describe it for me? Because it might be a quick one. Complicated? Okay. Then I will take a look into that specifically. But if you understand the concepts, we can move into the next one. We get the concepts, though? Okay. We'll move into the next one then shortly. All right. Next thing we need to talk about in terms of UV mapping. is improving our layout, improving the quality and the shape of our squares. We can do this, and it's a lot like ironing. Again, that cloth parallel. How many of you guys have ever ironed a button-down shirt? Right? I hate ironing a button-down shirt. That's one of my least favorite things ever. I used to have a restaurant job and I had to iron my white button-down shirt all the time. That is true. But in terms of ironing a button-down shirt, if you did it like I did it, you take that shirt and you throw it in the dryer on high heat, right? First, let it bang around as much as possible. Get all the wrinkles out, as much as you can get away with. And then, once it's all through the dryer, high heat, then you'll take an iron and you'll spot iron the areas that still need attention. The collars, the venting in the sleeves, the venting between the shoulder blades. Does that make sense? Around the buttons. Those things you got to go back and give them a little extra attention to make them crisp, because that's where you can really tell where the problems are. Well, we have tools in Maya to help our UV shells improve in quality, and they work the same way. Am I just throwing the whole thing in the dryer and banging out the wrinkles, or am I spot ironing areas that need more attention? Okay? And these tools will help us do that. In terms of the tool, we're going to talk about the Smooth UVs tool and the Unfold 3D tool. And again, they're both used to help kind of finesse the UV layout. It's almost like a last pass. I've created my UV shells, I've sewn them together, I've put the seams where I want them, it's looking pretty good, but now I need a little magic. Let's sprinkle something on there and up the quality if it improves the quality. And that's the key, because sometimes these tools actually don't help. It makes it harder. But sometimes they do. It improves. So let's take a look at those. You know, we've got an activity for it. Yes, it's the one we were just working on. And we're just going to go ahead and use those tools on those objects. So here's our UV shell. It's coming together pretty well. The squares look not bad, but here's where I have to take a look and see, can I improve this? Can I make this better? Okay, there's a couple of tools that do this. Two of the ones that I really like are the Smooth UVs tool and the Unfold tool. The Unfold tool comes across a little bit more like magic, because you just kind of press a button and it does its thing and you just cross your fingers and hope it does what you want. But the Smooth UVs tool is kind of an interactive one, and I like that one better because you can actually see what it's doing. So I'm going to show you that one first. All right, the Smooth UVs tool is, let me see where they put that now. That's under, yep, it's under tool. And the way this works is you literally grab all the UVs in any given shell, all right, and you use your Smooth UVs and you click it. And what happens is, again, you get one of these interactive things, and there's two capacities of the tool. You'll see that there is an unfold capacity and there's a relax capacity. And in terms of the two, I much prefer the unfold, but that doesn't mean relax doesn't work. So I would encourage you to play with that one. But I've not had as much success as easily as I have had with the unfold. Now, what's nice about the tool is, as I was saying, it's kind of interactive. So what you do is you put your cursor over the word, whichever one you want, unfold or relax, and hold down the left mouse button and drag. And what happens is it sort of interactively tries to iron out your UV shell. And as long as you hold down the left mouse button, you can drag between where you started and where the end is. Does that make sense? And you can literally stop at any point. So you can like do it and then go, you know what? I like it right up to there, and then I don't like it anymore, so I'm not going to do it anymore. I can just let go. Does that make sense? You can stop at any point. So you can sort of interactively adjust your UVs, which again, I kind of like that. Now, here's where it gets interesting and you have to ask yourself some questions. When I look at this, I've got smooth transition. Man, that looks good. All right. My squares are almost exactly the same size because it accounts for resolution issues if there are any still. But everything is at a slight angle, right? You notice when I started, my UV shell was square, right? Or rectangle. When I finished, it was curved. Does that make sense? So yes, it improved my layout. Yes, it improved my resolution, but at a price. My shell is now curved. Now, here's where I have to ask myself some questions. If I'm going to put some writing on the side of my marker, let's say my texture is a, there's some text on there. It says Markero on the side. Oh, where did my marker is missing. Here we go. I'll use this one. No, I won't. Yeah, I don't know what that is. There we go. Don't even ask me what I just touched back there. No, it didn't growl, but it sloshed. Yeah, it's not good. It was like that moment in Flash Gordon when they're reaching into the tree stump. Yeah, you probably didn't see that one either. Bad movies that I've seen and you haven't. All right, let's just say I'm going to put a texture on this marker. Right here, it's going to say Markero, right? If I'm creating text, I'm going to use an application like Photoshop to do it, right? When I create it, Markero, the greatest marker ever. Copyright. So if I'm making Markero, the greatest marker ever, that's the texture. That's what it's going to say right here, Markero. When I create it in Photoshop, it's going to create that word in a straight line. Does that make sense? If I create a text or text in a straight line that says Markero on it, when I try to put that on this UV shell, is it going to be straight? It's not going to be straight because my shell is curved. Does that make sense? It's not going to fit right. Now, it's true in Photoshop, we have tools that will allow us to bend text. So I could bend it to make it fit there. But that's going to change the font, the way it looks, because it's going to turn the text into a graphic, and it's going to distort the text somewhat when I warp it. Does that make sense? Okay, so point being, if I'm going to have text on here, I'm going to have a hard time putting that on there because my shell is curved and it creates text straight. So if I have to put text on there, maybe I shouldn't use the unfold tool. Maybe I just leave it like it was. Because when it's like this, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I can put text right on there, no problem, because it's already straight. Does that make sense? Again, these are second and third tier thoughts about UV layout and why I go one way versus another. These are really important thoughts. They're things I'm hoping will make more sense to you as you move through the program. But there's nothing wrong with getting your feet wet now.
What do you need to do?
Yes, absolutely. At every corner, regardless of what you're doing, right? So sometimes we unfold, sometimes we don't. I'd like you guys to use the Smooth UVs tool or the unfold tool because I think it's going to improve your layout. And since we are not going to have text on the stuff that we're showing, it won't hurt us. Does that make sense? The end game for what you're doing is this. Oh, wait. Right? This is our goal. This is what we're doing. Is there text on anything there? So I can use the unfold tool. I can use the smooth UVs tool, and it's not going to mess up my UV layout. It's not going to create a situation where I can't get text on there, or I'm not going to be able to put a graphic on there without distorting it. Does that make sense? That's why we have to think about, what do I need it to do? Because that dictates how we go about doing it. You answer your own questions and create new good questions when you know what you're going for. And that's why everybody gets copies of storyboards when you're on a project. Everybody gets written instructions. Everybody's got a supervisor that they're working through. The supervisor is constantly meeting with their supervisors. And everybody's talking to each other to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of what the goal is, which is why it is mission critical that if you are so lucky as to spend time with your supervisor, you write down everything that they say and make sure you do exactly that without deviation. Does that make sense? You are lucky if you get to spend time with your supervisor. Does that make sense? Okay, just trying to give you guys a mindset and a frame of reference why this stuff comes into play and why it's a big deal. Literally, I'm not making it up. This is why this is a big deal. Any questions on what we talked about so far? I know there's quite a bit, but anything? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so again, since this is our goal, we can use that Smooth UVs tool. I just want to make sure my skin's not going to start sizzling soon. All right. Let's go back to... No, I do expect something to crawl out of there. It scares the heck out of me. All right. Let's talk a little bit. Whoop. All right. So, oh, go ahead. You got a question? I'm not sure I understand your question. Try me again.
So with that marker, looks like there's multiple parts.
Yes.
So does each different type of thing have its own separate style of UV?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, that has a lot to do with how is this thing being used. The reason being, let's say we're building a marker, but it's going to be in a video game. Okay, so video games have things like poly limits. They also have texture limits. How big can your texture be? That's why the handheld games have lower quality resolution on their textures. They don't look as good because they can only calculate fast enough to do a small texture. So in the instance where this is a video game asset, I might have to put every piece of that marker, every bit of that shell in one 0-to-1 space. Does that make sense? One material is assigned to it and all the UVs fit into the 0-to-1. Does that make sense? I'd like you guys to do that. But know that typically it's going to be separated by material. Because if you look at that marker, nope, nope, there it is. If you look at that marker, this is felt, right? That's not very shiny. That's going to have a Lambert material. So if I'm making a movie and texture sizes don't matter, this is going to be made of a different material and therefore have a different 0-to-1 space for its UV layout. This is a shiny plastic material. That's going to have a different material. Maybe a blend. This will have its own 0-to-1 UV layout. This is a lightweight aluminum material. That might have like a Fong E for its material. Different UV layout. Does that make sense? Because it's by material. Because how it reacts towards light is a big part of the way it looks. Absolutely. What do I need it to do? It dictates everything. Good question, though. I really like that one. All right. Let's talk a little bit about UV layout. Okay, so again, for this class, I want you guys to have every piece nice, happy squares. And again, everything same size resolution, right? I don't want some parts of it to look high res and some parts to look low. The whole thing needs to be the same resolution. And that means the squares need to be the same size. Does everybody understand what that means? Okay, because you guys are going to be UV mapping your own geometry and you're going to have this same thing. Now, do objects have to have the same size squares? Two different objects? No. Within the same object, all the same size squares. Does that make sense? That's what matters. Resolution within the same object. Does that make sense? Okay, so make sure that those squares match. Now, once all that stuff matches, as soon as that's all good, everything's the same size squares, then we bring it all back into the 0 to 1. Then we make sure it all fits there again. And again, that's why we need that big workspace area so that we can do all this moving and sewing and cutting and ironing, and we do all that work. And then everything goes back into the 0 to 1. And again, nothing hangs out. Everything fits in there perfectly. And then we don't have pieces overlapping each other. They might be super close, but they don't overlap each other. Everything gets its own separate texture space. And that's what we call collage UVs. No overlapping. Nobody's on top of each other. Everything is separate. And what happens is, once we've got this layout, we can literally take a picture of this layout. It's called a UV snapshot. Literally, just take a picture of the 0 to 1 space, and then we can color it. We can paint it, and we can paint whatever we want, because the shell layout tells me where things go. So if I look at this piece, I go, oh yeah, there's the top of my torso. There's my chest. So I want to make sure to put the collars on there. There's the buttons. Let me get the details on here. This is the side of my body, so that's just going to be orange. It's literally paint by numbers. And the shell provides us where the paint goes. Because I can paint out here all day long. That's never going to show up on my model. But as soon as I paint inside one of these shells, that's going to show up on my model. Does that make sense? Or is that like a crazy thought? What do you guys think? Hands up, who thinks it makes sense? Okay. You can't do it in Maya, but you can do it in Photoshop, absolutely. Absolutely. Or bring the geometry into ZBrush and paint it in there. It's going to do the same thing, right? Or bring it into Substance Painter. And then you got your shell layout, and you start doing your textures in there. And then literally while you're texturing the geometry, the application is painting in where it's supposed to go. So again, what do I need to do? What's the path? What's the pipeline it's going through? Tells you what you need to do. All right? So this is how we generate textures. All right, so here's where we're going to start putting some textures together. All right, you guys remember last class? We had the plane, the cube, and the cylinder, and we UV mapped those three things, right? So in terms of those three objects, we mapped them already. Now we're going to apply textures to them. The important thing for you to understand is, number one, this is not typically the way texture application goes. We UV map, we create happy squares, we attach shells whenever and wherever we can, we bring them into the 0 to 1, then we generate a texture for it. We paint it, or we use ZBrush, or we use Substance Painter, and we create textures. But we don't have time to do it that path, because we would have to be now, okay, now let's all paint textures, and we could do that all day. Because that is, honestly, that's a lot of fun. I really like texture painting. How many of you guys paint? How many of you guys oils, acrylics, watercolors, anything like that? You guys are going to love painting textures because it's painting. You know, that makes sense. I remember when I was learning 3D, everything else is sort of abstract. But painting is painting. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in Photoshop or on actual paper. It's the same idea. So I actually really liked texturing because that made sense. But in terms of the texturing process, what we're going to do, because we don't have time to paint a texture now together as a class, is we made a texture in advance for you. And it fits pretty well into the UVs we've already created. Does that make sense? But that's not typically the way it goes. They don't make the texture first and then line them up. Does that make sense? Usually you create the texture after you create the layout. So I just wanted to preface it by that. This is not the way it goes. But this will help you understand the whole process of aligning your UV shells with texture and how that visual information transmits through the UV shell onto your geometry, seemingly by magic. All right, so if you remember last class, we UV mapped a plane, a cube, and a cylinder. Now we're going to apply textures to those guys. So please open up that file and we will get started with the application. Ah, there it is. All right, so here's my 3 pieces of geometry, and you can see, again, the squares don't have to be the same size from object to object. They just have to agree with each other in terms of the resolution. Notice that the squares on the top are the same as the size squares on the side. Does that make sense? Okay. Here's my 3 objects, and it's time to assign materials to them in order to plug in textures. And again, we made the textures in advance. So these are the steps for the application of a texture to a piece of geometry. These are the steps. 1, create a new material. And again, you guys should be kind of getting the hang of how this works now, because we've been doing it again and again. Repetition is a corner of learning. So we go to the Hypershade to create a new material. We use Lamberts in this class, so you click Lambert. All right. Now, this new Lambert is going to be the material I assign to the plane. So I'm going to name the material. Again, we name stuff as we go so it doesn't get confusing. So this is going to be called my plane material. All right. Now, the plane material has been named. Now I need to plug in my texture. Now I've already set my project to the activity file folder because that's what I'm working on as an activity. And it's very important for you to realize when it comes to assigning textures to geometry, it's just like trying to get image planes into Maya. Whenever Maya is looking for an image to use as information to put on geometry, it always goes to the source images folder. So remember, when you are applying a texture to your geometry, you will put the image of the texture in your source images folder. So if you take a look, I'm going to go to my activity file folder, documents, activity. In my source images folder, you'll see I have something called the plane texture, right? And it's this Totes Adorbs monkey. You don't think he's cute?
No.
Maybe that was behind the wall.
They didn't mean that. They're just talking. They're tired. Don't take it personally. But you'll notice it's in my source images folder. Does that make sense? That's where it has to be, because that's where Maya goes looking for that stuff. So what I'm going to do is I've got this new material. Who remembers, because this is going to be step number 2, who remembers how do I plug something into the color channel of a material? What did I do to do that? Because this is step 2. You go to the color channel, you go all the way to the end. Remember, this is how we plugged in the checker pattern, right? So you go to the color channel, step 2, go to the color channel all the way to the end to the little checker box, and we click on that with the left mouse button. That opens up the Create Render node. Now you remember we got the checker last time we were in here. The checker node was the one we got last time. This time we click the node called File. File means image. If you look at it, it's supposed to be like 2 mountains and a little sun. I don't know, that doesn't even look like that anymore. They changed the icon, but that's what it is. So you click on the File node, and that creates a file node.
Where's the file node?
In the Create Render node window, if you click on the checker box at the end of the color channel.
Like the Create Render node?
Yep. If you go to the material, hold on one second, let me do it again for you. In the color channel of the material, you go to the end of the channel, you go to the checker box, and you click on it with the left mouse button. That launches the Create Render node window. Then you go to the File node, which is the 4th one down.
It's not opening yet. Oh, now it is.
There you go. Click on the File node, and that opens the File node. Now, you'll notice that your material looks jet black right now in the sample. And if you look at the material in the Hypershade, it looks jet black. That's because Maya doesn't know what texture to plug in there. You told it, I want you to use a picture to color my geometry, but it doesn't know which one you want to use yet. So the material is completely jet black. So what you want to do is come to the File Attributes section, and you'll see image name, and it's blank right here because Maya doesn't know what image to put in there. But I do have one of these handy dandy yellow folders, which if you recall, what that means is navigate me to the thing I'm looking for. Show me where it is. Lead me to it. Show me the path. So I click on the yellow folder, and immediately it goes to my activity file folder. It goes to my source images folder because I set my project, and it's asking me, well, which one of these do you want? Well, I want the plain texture. Boop. And it takes that and it plugs it into the material. Does that make sense? That's what's coloring the material now, the picture. Now, in terms of my UVs, I'm going to actually take this out of the 0 to 1 for a second first. So it's time for me to assign that texture or that material. So this is the next step. The next step is assigning the material that I've created to the object. Who can tell me how to do that? I can select the object in object mode, hold down the right mouse button and choose Assign to Selected. Absolutely. I can also, if I want to, middle mouse button, drag and drop. Also. And again, there's a couple other ways as well. But any of those will work. All right, so now my geometry is made of this material with the monkey on it. But you can see it doesn't look right. So if I go to my UV editor, oh yeah, my UVs are not in my 0 to 1. So it's not framing it. Remember we talked about framing stuff? All right, so right now it's not framing it. So what's happening is I am outside the 0 to 1, so my texture is just repeating. So if I want things to go specifically in here, what I'm going to do is take that UV shell and I'm going to put it into the 0 to 1, right on top of my monkey picture. And then there it is. It's actually on there. Now, if I distort my UV layout, I shocked the monkey, right?
He actually expected that way.
So, but important to note, do I still have a little bit of latitude to kind of adjust my UVs even after the texture's been created, just to make it look a little bit better, tweak it? Absolutely. We have the ability to make little changes, but if you change it too much, you're going to distort the texture layout. Does that make sense? Little tweaks are okay. but be gentle. But now you can see, wow, that actually looks like a painting. It looks 3D. And that's because there's a texture on it that suggests 3D. We determine 3D by highlights and shadows, which give us the illusion of depth, and that's how we perceive depth. So if I paint highlights and shadows on there, that looks 3D to me. It's just a geometry plane, but it looks a lot more complex because of the texture. My friends who are working in the game industry, this is their favorite aspect of working on video games, because you can take something as simple as a geometry plane and make it look like a dragon if you paint it right, because it's all sleight of hand. Does that make sense? This is the power of textures. This is why we UV. Stuff looks way cooler when we map it and texture it. So UV mapping, not the most fun thing ever, but what it leads to is the nuggets. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is why we do it. This is why we do it. All right, so now let's do the next one. All right, because there's more fun stuff we need to learn about. We're going to work on the cube. And again, I'm going to take my shells out of the 0 to 1 so that we can do the alignment. Again, the steps are going to be the same. Step 1 was what? If I want to assign a texture to my geometry, what's step 1? Create a new material. So we know how to do that. Do you see why I give you these things, these activities? They build on one another. They lead to one to the next. New Lambert, absolutely. So we go to the Hypershade to do that. We make a new Lambert. And again, the process is annoying, but thankfully it's repetitive, so you can learn it and then you don't have to worry about it as much. I'm going to name it my cube material. All right, cube material. Now, how do I attach the picture to the color? What do? I want to put the picture on the geometry. Go to the color channel. What's next? Go over here, that's right, over to the checker box and click on that, which will open up the Create Render node. And the node we want is File. All right. And again, Maya doesn't know what picture to plug in there, so where do I go? I go to the little yellow folder and click on it. And because I set my project, it goes right to my source images folder. And I find my cube texture and plug it in. So now the material is showing the texture that we've created, right? Here's my cube material. How do I get it onto my cube? This is the last step. I can assign it. I can either select it, hold down the right mouse button and choose Assign to Selected, or again, middle mouse button, drag and drop. Either is fine. But wait, it looks not right. What must be wrong with it? My shells are not aligned properly. Let's go take a look. So here we are in the editor. Oh yeah, there they are. My shells are all out here. My texture's in here. That's why things aren't appearing in the right place. Does that make sense? Why everything's got to go back into 0 to 1? Okay. Now there's a new wrinkle, a new lesson on this one. So please pay attention. All right. So I'm trying to line this up. Let's say this is going to be the front of my box right here, right? And I want to put the texture on right here. So if I select it, I see this shell is that shell. And when I look at my textures, this is definitely like the front view of that box, monkey in a cage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this shell and put it on that box. All right, and now, magically, that texture is on the right face. I just moved it. I'm going to do it again. You watch me. Let's say I want to put the top on this texture, right? The top should go here. That's the top of the box. So I select the face in question, this one. Yep, face mode. That will then tell me which one of these shells goes there. This shell represents the top. When I look at my texture, this is the top of my texture. This is what the roof of my monkey cage should be right here. So I'm going to take this shell and I'm going to move it and place it right over that roof part.
But when I click it's selecting all the boxes, not one.
Make sure you didn't hit the B key by accident.
What
B, the letter B on your keyboard?
I did.
Okay. Well, watch me do it again. Let's try it again. You ready? I'm going to do this side. Select the face where I want to put the texture. When I select just that one face, make sure you're only selecting one. When I come over here, I see this is the face that's going to go there. So I bring it over and I place the shell over the image in the 0 to 1 that represents what I want to appear on the side. All right. Let's do it again. Here's the bottom. I select the shell. This is the bottom of the texture. This is the shell that I'm going to put there. So I drag it and place it, and then it appears where it should go. Here's the back. When I look at my texture, here's the back of the monkey. So that's the one that goes there. Drag it. Frame it. Looks good. Now I've only got one side left. Select this one. One shell left, and here is where it goes. Now, looks good here, looks good here, looks good here, looks good on the bottom, looks good on the back. Whoops. Watch out for that monkey. He's got regnad. It's definitely deadly disease. He's got a bad case of Shellus upside-downus. All right. Regnad. That's not what it should read. What should it read? It should read danger. Ah, and the monkey's facing the wrong direction. Something's wrong. Anybody want to guess? Go ahead, you can try. The shell's backwards. That's exactly the problem. The shell is backwards. That's why it's reading backwards. The monkey's facing the wrong way, and it says regnad, not danger. Now, what's nice is when you have text on something, you can tell when your shell is backwards because you can see it. But what if there was no text on this thing? How would I know that was backwards? The monkey's facing the wrong way. But you'd have to be really astute to pick that up. Does that make sense? You might not catch that, especially when you've got a deadline and a ton of stuff going on. Because you think about the simple little things you guys miss with your turn-ins for this class, right? You got a lot going on, not much time to do it. Guess what? That's the way that it is in the industry. It's not like you're lounging about, you know, having Pop-Tarts and talking about Skyrim or, yeah, no, wouldn't that be cool? That's not the way the work is. What you are doing in this classroom is what you will be doing in the field. No, well, then you can sit around and talk about Skyrim, but you talk very quickly and you're working while you're doing it. But the point is, details get missed. People get tired. Does that make sense? That happens. What happens here is what will happen there, which is why we write stuff down. Does that make sense? Because even if you're tired, you can read most of the time. All right, now, so this is backwards. There's a problem. Again, you might happen to catch it, you might not. The good news is Maya actually has a way of telling you when things are upside down. You can look for it. If you go to the UV editor and you go to View and you choose Shaded, what happens is Maya will shade your UV shells for you. If you have the older version of Maya, it's, I think it's under Modify Shade UVs in your editor. Somebody let me know if that's right or not. The older version. Image, thank you. Image Shade UVs. So you go to Image and check off Shade UVs, and Maya will color it. Blue means your shell is facing the correct direction. Red means it is upside down. Does that make sense? Okay, so we can fix that though. It's super easy. All you have to do is select the shell in question. If you're in the old version of Maya, you go to polygons on the way left and go down and you'll see flip. If you're in the new version of Maya, you go to modify and choose flip. Both are the same thing. They literally just flip the shell over so it's going the other way. So you can just go in there, grab the shell that's the wrong color, and flip it. Grab the shell and flip it. When they're all blue, they're all facing the right direction. Does that make sense? They all have their own space. Everything is in the 0 to 1. Everything's blue. And we started with happy squares. Do you think that these are pretty much the foundations for what makes a good UV layout? Yes. Bigger question. Do you think this is what I'm grading you on?
Yes.
Yes. So when I'm grading your UV assignments, what I'm looking for is everything's in the 0 to 1. Nice happy squares. Shells are not on top of each other. Everything's blue. You do that, you got it. Select the UV shell and either go to modify and choose flip or go to polygons and choose flip. It depends on which version of the UV editor you have, but it's that simple. Yeah, there's always a button, absolutely, for flipping stuff. Yep.
Is it possible to assign the textures just to faces rather than the whole object, so you don't need to have the separate?
Yes and no. You could do that because you can assign material by face and you could assign the image to the material, but it probably wouldn't fit right. The odds of you getting those proportions correct are not very good. You could do that. It's not an impossibility, but very likely it would not give you the result you were looking for. But I would encourage you to try it. In fact, anything you guys are like, hey, I wonder what would happen if I did this. Do it. Find out. You know what I mean? Because that's how you learn new stuff. You know, who in their right mind thought when they were inventing chainsaws that they could make art with it? Right? Nobody. But can we take a block of ice and cut it with a chainsaw and sculpt it with a blowtorch? Hell yeah, we can. We can make some beautiful stuff with that. But that is not what those things were designed for. So can you discover brand new ways to use tools? Yes, you can. So should you explore and try? Hell yeah. Does that make sense? Try it. The worst that's going to happen is Maya freaks out and goes night-night. You just launch it again. Welcome back. You're not off the hook yet, Maya. So explore. All right, so this one's looking pretty good. We got that nice layout. Let's do the third one together. All right. Here's our object. We've already turned on the shade UVs thing, so I can already see, yeah, one of them's not facing the right way because it's red. So I'm going to flip it now. Again, all you have to do is grab the UV, or grab the entire shell. Make sure you got everything. And flip it. Flip it good. There we go. All right. So let's do this one. Again, the steps are the same. I want to apply a texture. Who can tell me the steps? Not you. I'm glad you know it though, but I want somebody different to tell me. I like the change in the voices. It makes it interesting. Go ahead, you tell me. Make a new Lambert, step 1. Windows, rendering editor's hypershade. I make a new Lambert. Again, thank goodness this process is repetitive to a certain degree, because then I can memorize it. Then, of course, we name it. This is going to be cylinder material. Absolutely. All right. What's the next step?
Sorry.
It's okay. I like your enthusiasm. Who wants to tell me the next step? Go ahead.
Okay, you're going to want to approve the box for the file.
That's right. I want to go to the color channel. I go all the way to the checkbox at the end and click on it. And it opens up my Create Render node. Yes.
And the next step is click file.
And then click File. Thank you. Number 4 in the list. Okay. What's the next thing I do? Who can tell me? Go ahead. Click the folder. And then, again, because I've set my project, it goes right to my source images folder and says, which one do you want? If I don't set my project, it's harder, right? Interesting thought, though. I'm setting up a path to this image so Maya can find it. Do you think if I move that image, Maya will be able to find it? No, it won't. If you change the path, Maya's going to keep following that path because Maya's a machine. And at this point is not capable of making too many of its own decisions. So if you move things, it won't be able to find it. Hence, we set the project whenever we start something so that everything knows where everything is. Okay, so I'm going to go find my cylinder and bring that in. What's the next step? Drag and drop it on there, right? Cylinder, drag and drop, or right mouse button, whatever your style of application is. That's correct. Also works. All right. So now I've got this texture in here, and I've got these shapes that I've got to fit, right? So I can take these shapes, and obviously one of them is the bottom, right? So I just made that the bottom. And this one is the top. And that just happens to be the order I selected them, you know. That's up to you. There's the top. So now you can see when I put that on there, there's the top, there's the bottom. So now all we have to do is put the side on. All right, here's the side. I drag that over there. Whoops. Wait a minute. What do I have to do with this thing?
Rotate it.
I got to rotate it, right? Rotate it. Bring it into place. Okay. Now, here. Awesome. Just want to make sure I did that right, i.e. wrong. There's the top of my can, right? That's the top. There's my label. Is my label on right? What's wrong with my label?
It's upside down.
It's upside down. See, this is the top of my can here. But my label's not on there right. So I need to what? I need to flip it, all right? So what I'm going to need to do is whoop, just flip it this way. All right, and now the top of my can is near the top of my can. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, one more last little fun thing I'm going to do to improve the quality of this layout. You guys see that? That break in my texture, that interruption in the beautiful fluidity? It happens all the time, right? Label. But It's also happening to the metal of my can, which is a no-no. But the good news is I can fix that. I can see where the seam is. Because again, if my can wraps around, right, just like we were doing with the marker, right? If it's a cylinder, and I lay it out flat, there's going to be a seam. That's going to happen for real, just like in the real world. That paper label has a seam on it. If that was just paper, it probably would be okay. And it doesn't look great, but the metal is also not working. Does that make sense? There shouldn't be a seam on the metal, but I can fix it. Remember how I was saying you can make little adjustments to your UVs even after the texture's been created. So this is what I'm going to do to fix that seam. All right. If I come in here, here's the bottom of my can. Here's my UV. Do you see how I can wiggle it just a little bit? I'm dropping some fat beats here. I don't know if you guys are picking this up.
Oh, okay.
All right. I can adjust that to try to fix the seam. Looks pretty good at the top. But did you see how just a little bit of tweaking, I can help hide that seam better? That's going to help. That's going to make things look more believable. Yes?
Is there a channel box for the UV editor for the rotation that has to be a 90-degree truth? Or is it
That's a good question. I don't think so, but let's take a look. There are workarounds you can use to do that, but let me just see. All right. Let me see what shows up here. I'm going to make sure my attribute editor is open. Yeah, not really. But what you can do is if you double click on any tool, its settings open up in here, and you could do something like, say, I'd like to have it change at a certain rate. Like I want to have it move at 90 degrees, or I want to have it move at 45-degree increments. And you can have it snap on those various adjustments. Let me see where that is. Snap step. Switch that to absolute, and then plug in the value. 90-degree rotations, 45-degree, whatever you want. It's a good question. Many tools have fun little options in that. Again, I encourage you guys to explore. Look in there. Well, that was kind of a thing in another tool. Maybe that's a thing in this one too. So you don't know till you mess. So play with it. So UVs are lined up pretty good now. Textures look good now. Does that make sense? Is there anybody who didn't follow that stuff? Please let me know. Again, thank goodness it's fairly repetitive because you can kind of learn the steps. I just grabbed the UVs and literally moved them in position until it lined up. Yeah, you don't want to move the verts because that changes the shape of the object. But you can move the UVs because they're just a representation. So you can tweak them a little bit. All right. All right. Any questions about this stuff? No? Okay, good. Now, I'm sorry, was there a question? About the UVs. For this class, no. Not for this class. Because for this class, that's what I want you guys to look for. I want to see happy squares. That's the given. Right? I want to see everything in the 0 to 1. There should not be any shells outside the 0 to 1. Don't leave any of them out there. They're abandoned and homeless. It's not nice. Bring them all into the 0 to 1. Right? All the shells facing the right direction, blue. We know how to look for that, right? We look under Image, Shade UVs, or we go to View and choose Shaded Mode. And then we get to see that. So make sure you got that going on. And then the last thing, we want to make sure we don't have shells on top of each other. None of that going on for this class. In some instances, you might want shells on top of each other. This class, no. No, that doesn't really happen, but can you guess why some of them were upside down? Why were some of them upside down? You have to think back to last class, which makes it harder. But can anybody imagine why the shells might be upside down? Because that's a great question. How the heck does that even happen?
Because you took the picture of the plane on the negative side of the axis.
You guys remember when we had the cube and we were taking a picture of the x-axis? Positive x was this way, right? If we wanted to take a picture of the outside of that cube, it would have been a picture in negative x, but that wasn't an option. Does that make sense? So when we took that picture in x, we were taking a picture of the side of the box through the inside. That's why the shell was upside down. Good question, excellent answer. Make sense? Yay, all right. Now, let me show you something real quick before we move on. We've been talking about collage UVs, the fact that they all get their separate space and why that's important. I just want to show you really quickly stacked UVs and ask you a question. Let's take a look at our monkey cage for this example. All right. Let's say I wanted this texture on every side of my cube, right? All 6 sides would look like this. It's like an ammunition crate. You know, what video game have you ever played that doesn't have a crate for you to break open with ammo in it, right? Not one. So if I want this texture to appear on every side of this cube, I could, if I wanted to, literally grab my UV shells and put all of my shells on top of each other. This is stacked UVs. And where that comes in handy is I can paint one texture and put it on everything. Because whatever is in that inside of that shell is what appears on the object. Does that make sense? Every side of this thing has the same thing on it. This is a stacked UV layout, literally like pancakes. Now, we're not doing this for this class, but there are some instances where that is to your advantage. Stacked UV shells. Where would that be handy? Well, let's take a look at come on, you punk. Where are you? I miss you. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Here's an asset for a video game. Zombie Pirate. What could be cooler? Here's the geometry. Very light, very simple, right? It's obviously a low poly game. But with the texture on it, that thing looks really cool. Here is the texture map for the Zombie Pirate. That's the 0 to 1 space. Question. Why is there only half a face? Go ahead. You could basically take a UV shell of the face, cut it in half, put one shell on top of the other, and then take both of those shells and put it on the face, and then it would show the same texture on both sides. Bigger question, why would you do, oh, sorry.
So when you did that, would you have to put one of the shells so it mirrors and it's not like repeated?
That's correct. You would have to flip it. Because in order for them to match up perfectly, it would have to be flipped. You're right. Good question. Yeah, point her out when she does that again. I can't see through the light. Yeah, no, when I look over there, it's just like I'm waiting to get hit by something, you know, a train or whatever. In fact, I can't even see now. But bigger question. Yes, we can cut the shell in half. Yes, we can flip them and put them on top of each other. The texture will show through. But why would I only paint half of the face? Why would I do that? I mean, I could easily paint the whole face, but why would I paint just half of it and go through the difficulty of cutting my shells in half and sticking them on top of each other? If I can make half a face, I take up half of the space and I can make that face bigger and therefore have a higher resolution of my texture. Exactly. Does that make sense? That's why. Good for you. You know what? I don't know how many pieces there are. He's 512 tries. So not very many polygons to make that guy. And the texture is 256 by 256, which is pretty low res. Similarly, he's only got one hand textured, but they're on both sides. Same thing. Does that make sense? I think you guys get this. That's awesome. All righty. This information will serve you well. Okay. Excellent. All right. Let us now look into something else. Let's look into, dun, 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 the creation of an AO pass, or ambient occlusion. Now, this is a really fun way to add some texture information to your geometry. What it does is it basically looks at your geometry, it finds little shadowy areas, and it kind of permanently puts those shadows in there, and it accentuates detail. They're called an AO pass, or ambient occlusion pass. It's also called a dirt pass because it makes stuff look a little bit dirty. It's also called a speck pass. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's all the same thing. We're really kind of adding some depth to our models. It makes them look really cool. In fact, if you're not going to put any texture on your model whatsoever, I recommend at least putting an AO pass on it because it really accentuates detail. It makes your work look better in terms of trying to get work. Now, for this class, the ambient occlusion is completely optional. You don't have to do this at all. I recommend it because, again, first, it's easy and it makes your model look better, so why not do it? But I want you to know you don't have to do this. Does that make sense? Totally optional, but very cool. And it really drives home the idea of why do we make good UV layout. Now, to understand ambient occlusion, you kind of have to understand what's going on. If you guys make a fist right now and look at the top of your fist, and you see you've got kind of these wrinkles on your hand where it crinkles up. And if you look, it kind of looks like a little tree, like this is the ground, and those are the branches. It's like a Charlie Brown tree. What you're seeing is sort of an element of self-shadowing. Light can't quite get in there. And as a result, you see some shadow in there. But what that does is it really accentuates the detail of your hand. That's what those shadows do. That's effectively ambient occlusion. It's the same kind of idea. When you create an ambient occlusion texture, what you're doing is kind of recording where this shadow information is on your geometry specifically. And it kind of accentuates that shadowing because it is something that light really does. So we can do that with our models and it makes them look better, more realistic, much more interesting. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what the AO pass is. And we can use that AO pass, again, to create a texture for our geometry. Now, in terms of how it works, it's kind of a weird process. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with old school photography. You take a picture and you take the photographic paper and you put it into the fixative element and it sort of brings out the shadows and the highlights and it generates an image. And basically the paper helps to record light and shadow information. It's special paper, right? The way the AO pass works is we create a special kind of material. So rather than a special piece of paper, not Lambert, we have this special material that we assign to an object. And that material, all it does is read light information. It figures out where shadows fall, and it draws a picture of where those shadows are on your model. So when you've got good UV layout, it draws the shadows exactly where they're supposed to go. Does that make sense? It records it in the form of an image. And then you can take that image and you can literally plug it into the color channel of your material. And now you've got basically permanent shadow on your model. And again, it really accentuates detail because it makes the deeper, sort of darker design elements of your model, it recesses them somewhat by adding additional shading to it. And then the other areas appear lighter and it really accents the detail that you've built into your model. And that's why they look good when that's on there.
Would you want to do this if you were actually going to go through the whole lighting process? Because it could maybe look like it's a different lighting shading.
Well, that's an excellent question. But when you create the ambient occlusion, it assumes light is coming from all angles. So it's not going to give you false shadows that would disagree with your natural lighting, because that is a concern. But if you created some lights and set them up and then created your AO pass, that would create inconsistent shadows. Does that make sense? So that is a legitimate concern and a good thought. But because light is coming from every angle when you create the AO, it's not light specific. Like if the light's shining here, the shadow goes there. Does that make sense? That does not happen, thankfully, unless I set it up to do that. Yes.
So would you do either or, like if you're creating lights in Maya, would you do that instead of this and vice versa? You can't do both.
I would use them together.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Wait, but wouldn't it create problems?
Well, here's what I would do. With the AO pass, again, it's sort of an ambiguous shadow pattern. So it's going to be light from all angles, and only the very deep sort of crevasses of the surface will catch shadow information, much like your finger. Now, if you look at your hand when you make a fist, you can see the self-shadowing. And under this lighting, it looks the same no matter where I am in the room. Does that make sense? But if I get really close to this light source and burn out the rods and cones of my eye, that will somewhat alter the shadow information in here, because that's very bright. Does that make sense? But that's a legitimate concern. How do they affect each other? But you can create an AO pass and assign it to your geometry and then use it under whatever lighting you wish, specialized lighting. And then when you create the final rendered image, it will incorporate both of those elements. Does that make sense? It's very smart though. I like that question too. Yes. The difference between ambient occlusion and the normal map is the idea that the ambient occlusion is reading the surface of your geometry and it's just recording where the shadows would be due to the depth of the geometry, the physical geometry, versus the normal map, which is using lighting to create changes in the shape of the geometry in terms of its appearance and how it's lit. One is recording what is, and the other is changing what is. Does that help at all? Probably not, but I appreciate the fact that you're humoring me. Normal maps are basically used to create more detail than there really is on geometry using light information, much like this soften normals does on geometry. When we soften the geometry to make it look more smooth than it really is, that's just light. Normal map does the same thing. It says, this surface isn't flat, it's bumpy. But it uses lots of lights to kind of figure out where the highlights and the shadows should be to give the illusion of shape change and contour where there is no geometry to support that. Does that make a little bit more sense? Okay.
My question was, did you use that for your Lego man?
Yes, I did. I did create an AO pass for my Lego guy, absolutely, because they look more cool when you put it on there. Because again, it accentuates the detail. And the other really nice thing that the AO pass will do for you is when you create that texture, that image of where the shadows fall on your geometry, when you take a look at that image, you can literally bring that into Photoshop and it's almost like a guide. You can use that to help you paint because it's showing you the shadow areas on there. So you can sort of accentuate it somewhat and build on that in terms of your painting technique. So again, it does a number of really cool things, and that's why I think it is very much to your advantage to utilize this amazing tool. It does all kinds of fun stuff. But let me see. Am I out of time? I'm always out of time. I'm not playing with you anymore, Brian. Okay, well, here's the deal. I don't have time to show you the ambient occlusion, but I know, I'm sad too. But do you think I made a video of it? Yes, I did, and it's on the skill check. There are a couple of steps, but what you're going to find out is, oh yeah, I kind of know some of these steps because of other texture-related things we've done in this class. Does that make sense? What I will walk you through with the little bit of time I have is I'm going to show you how to set up the Arnold renderer, because that's kind of wacky new-new. So I'm going to show you how that works to create those images. But like I said, if you follow the video, it's going to work great. But let me just show you the setup of the rendering engine so you've got that. And then the video is, like I said, it's very slow. It goes through everything step by step. If you watch it, it will help you do it. And it is, I believe it's contained within the skill check for this lecture. If I remember right, that's where I put it. Skill check 9. So it should be on that activity. But let me show you the setup of Arnold. Because what we're going to do for our skill check is, that doesn't help at all. What we're going to do for our skill check is we're going to create an ambient occlusion pass for an object. And again, that's the skill check. But in terms of your final assignment, like your week 4 turn-in, you don't have to do an AO pass. You do have to do it for the skill check. But the good news is it's super easy. Now, in terms of the skill check, we give you the object, this pepper mill, right? So you don't have to build it. We already UV'd it. You don't have to UV it. All you have to do is make the AO pass for it. Does that make sense? And that is by far the easiest part, trust me. One piece of information that's very important though with creating the AO pass for the pepper mill is when you are creating the AO pass, before you create it, what you want to do is select all the pieces of the pepper mill and combine it. Mesh, combine. The reason being, when you combine it, When you create the AO pass, Maya will look at it and pretend it is one object. So you will get one texture map for it. If it's a whole bunch of pieces and you leave it in a whole bunch of pieces and you create the texture map, it's going to make a texture map for each piece, which is not the end of the world, but what you end up having to do is assign a new material to each piece and then plug into the color channel the texture that's appropriate for each piece. So that becomes annoying. Way easier if you just select all the pieces, mesh, combine, and then create the AO pass for it. Does that make sense? Just makes your life easier. Me to you suggestions. You don't have to do it. Yes?
So after that, would you like separate them and they would automatically have their own texture maps?
Oh yeah, because as long as you don't move the UVs around, that's going to hold true.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
they'll automatically do their own then.
Mm-hmm. Yep, totally fine. You just have to combine it so Maya thinks of it as one. Otherwise, it just makes a bunch of texture maps. All of which are fine. It's just more complicated to connect them. But let me just show you how to set up the rendering engine. And we're going to talk more about rendering engines next class. All right. Now, in terms of rendering engines, if you go to Window, Rendering Editors, Render Settings. When you open this up, you will see that Maya defaults to rendering with software, right? Now, there are other rendering engines in there. And basically, it's like saying there are different ways to draw a picture. And we're gonna go into more detail about what all that is. But the one we want to use to create the AO pass is called Arnold, the Arnold renderer. But you'll notice I don't have that as an option. I don't see it. That's because we have to load it. It does not load by default. Arnold is a rendering engine that is built by a third party, which means somebody else made it, but they made it so it would work with Maya, kind of like an accessory. So we have to turn it on. Now, the process of turning it on is very simple. These are the steps. Go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. The Plugin Manager is the window in Maya that houses all of the plugins, all of the cool stuff that were built by other companies, and they made it so it would work with Maya. Not everything is turned on. Quite a few things are turned off, just so it won't take so long to load, I would imagine. But quite a few things are turned off, so we have to turn Arnold on. So we go to the Plugin Manager, and when we open up the Plugin Manager, you'll see there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. Just keep scrolling down, and you will see there we go. This one, which is called the MTOA bundle. That is the Maya to Arnold bundle. And if you use the link that we gave you to download Maya, Arnold is in there as an option. If you got Maya from somewhere else or some other link, it's not. So you got to download the one that we put you onto, because I know it's in there. So you go to Load It and click on it with your left mouse button, and it will load Arnold for you. And then all you have to do is hit refresh. And this will load Arnold. And you will know it's been loaded because you will see Arnold as one of your menu set items all of a sudden. It was not there before. And also, when you go to Window, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, you will see Arnold as an option now, where it was not previously an option. No, doesn't matter. Arnold can be on, off, it doesn't make any difference. But by default, it's usually off. So I'm not sure why yours is on, but that's all right. But the point being, by default, it isn't typically on. So we have to turn it on. And that's why I show you guys that, because it's kind of weird, that process and that whole thought that there are parts of Maya that are not turned on right now. Again, much like if you're playing a game on your computer and you don't have enough RAM or what have you to run the game properly, you have to turn off some of the cool functions in order to get it to run at real time without the lag. Same kind of idea. Not everything is turned on in Maya. So we got to turn it on, that's all. Your question? Okay. Okay, yeah, let me know, because if you have a question. But anyway, that's how you turn on the Arnold renderer, and then you'll be able to create the AO pass, because when you turn on the Arnold renderer, it then makes new materials in the hypershade. And one of the new materials that it makes is that special material that captures light information and records shadow. Does that make sense? And that's not available until you turn Arnold on. Now, just so you can see, let me see if I've got one I can show you. So again, for your skill check, you're going to be creating that. Let me see if I've got one. Oh, and well, here's one. Here's the AO pass, the texture that was created for the jar. Okay, so if you look at this, this is my 0 to 1. You can imagine what it looks like in the 0 to 1. What do you think this is? The bottom of my jar, right? The bottom, but the outside of the jar, right? This is inside the jar where it's dark. Yeah, does that make sense? Outside bottom, light shines on that, okay? Here's my jar. What's this part, you think? The outside, right? You can see the little rim, that little neck there. What's that part? The inside, shadow. You notice how it's lighter at the top and it gradually gets darker because the light has a harder time getting inside. Does that make sense? This is a texture map. This is an AO pass for the jar. So if I assign this to my jar, I will see that fun little shadowing in there. Like I said, it accentuates detail. It looks great. It really makes your models pop, which is what you want. You're trying to catch people's eye and show them the detail you took so much time to build. Make sense? Okay. So again, we gave you the object. It's already UV mapped, so all you have to do is create the AO pass for it. If you wanted to, you could also try to create an AO pass for your jar. You have the tools, you can do it. And like I said, in terms of your final turn-in, you don't have to do an AO pass for your geometry, but you can if you want to. Your call. All right? Any questions about that stuff we've talked about? Skill check. AO the pepper mill. Do the jar if you want to, too. No? We good? Are you kidding me? I would bet the ranch someone's completely lost. But I just want to make sure if we have the opportunity to raise questions, because what I've noticed about questions is if one person asks, then a bunch will jump on. Okay. Oh, okay. We'll get right back to that then, because we're about to go into lab, so I can help you with that. Anybody else? Okay, well, we can we can address that in the lab. And if you are one of my digital friends, that's when you go to the Google Hangout. That's a great opportunity to get some feedback and some help on that. So thank you very much, everybody. I think you guys did terrific today with the UVs. I'm really excited about how much you guys seem to have digested with a very complicated subject matter. This is going to help you out so much in model creation and honestly even beyond. It's going to be really, really good for you guys. It makes me very happy to see how much you guys got this. It means a lot. So great job today. Let's bring that every day. And we'll see you guys on, what's today, Tuesday? Thursday. Thursday we'll do it again. It will be lecture 10. We will talk about rendering to create those final images. And then we will have a group hug because it's our second to last lecture ever. I'm just kidding about the group hug thing. All right. See you guys later. Thank you very much. I will see you on Thursday. And we will talk about that rendering stuff because that's quite the end of the project for us. Good job, guys. Thank you, Brian. You were awesome.